That sounds so ominous. Like, should I get out now? Who was that strange voice in my head? But we are going to record just the lecture part or the talk part of the talk tonight with Bryce. So what we're going to ask is once he starts, if everybody would go on mute. Um, but before that, does anybody have any questions about anything about the organization, about tonight, anything at all? Thanks for the direct link, JC. JC's always handy with that. All right, then. Well, if nothing else, Bryce, it's all yours.
Awesome. Thank you. I am Bryce Sharp, and this talk tonight is JSON Amalgamation. I am going to be using this view, so hopefully everybody can see everything. And hopefully I'm not blocking any valuable slide content in the bottom right. I didn't think that part through. I don't think there's anything over there, but I'll move it if I have to. Yeah, so the talk tonight is JSON Amalgamation. I'm very excited about giving this talk. There's a problem that we have at work, that is that we have a lot of legacy clients sending us millions of reports a day. And those clients were all written before documentation. And as a developer who works on those APIs, documentation would be very nice to have. But the task of going back and documenting 15 years worth of legacy clients and report types is very daunting, and is something that would take a person a long time to do just typing it out. And so as the developer that I am, I have automated these problems out of existence. So what's in this talk? There are 4 main points. We're going to talk about what is JSON amalgamation. Then we're going to talk about why do we need JSON amalgamation. We're going to talk about how do we actually amalgamate JSONs, and the future of JSON amalgamations. So what is a JSON amalgamation? Well, starting with the 2 words in it, the JSON is JavaScript object notation. It's a lightweight data interchange format. And amalgamation is the action, process, or result of combining or uniting. So you can probably tell from this that we're going to take JavaScript objects, JSONs, and we are going to unite them into a JavaScript object that's useful for our documentation. So a brief step back. My name is Bryce. I'm a software engineer too at Ookla. What Ookla does, our flagship product is speedtest.net, which this is a screenshot of ookla.com. And this is actually a live counter. So it's already like 37 million. So we get a lot of data. Like we get 30 million JSONs a day, and those are just the results. Each one of those is backed by a config request. So the APIs that we work with, they experience extreme volume, and that volume presents a lot of challenges. But one of the challenges that isn't directly related to the volume and more about our organization as a whole is that the original speed test was in a browser. It is in Iron Man 2, I believe. Iron Man actually runs a speed test at one point. So we've been around for a long time. And the apps that we run, so be it our Android app, our iOS app, our web app, or we have CLI tools, we also have embedded devices. All of those grow and change over time with business requirements. So the app that is there today does not look like the app that was there 10 years ago, 15 years ago. And so those things change over time. And what we get mostly is JSON. But those JSONs contain information. And so there are things that are consistent throughout them all, like a download speed or a device information block. But what we want to do is be able to go back for all of time and say, hey, document everything that developers wrote at Ookla in the past 15 years. And that task has kept me up at night for a long time, and has led me to do some ingenuity. Yes, some ingenious is what I meant to say, transformation of our JSON payloads into YAML, and that's what we're going to look at today. So we've established that Ookla gets tens of millions of JSONs a day. We've established that those JSONs are generally, and obviously not all of them are about download speed, but a good chunk of them are about download speed. So they'll include information like download. So a very contrived example here is a JSON that only has 3 keys in it. Our real JSONs are thousands of keys, hundreds of keys, nested properties, and it gets very convoluted. So this is very contrived, but you can see here that we have 3 properties. We've got device, here it's a Samsung Galaxy 5. We've got download, it's 86,000 kilobits, megabits, whatever you want to call it today. And then we've got the version of the app that it's running. So this is one JSON. So a similar JSON might look like this. Here we have a device, it's a Samsung Note 7. We have download, it's at 98,000 this time. It's still the same app version, but now we have a new field called battery exploded and it's set to true. And so this is where we get to that difficulty, because we have a report that's running the same version of our app, but it's reporting different data. And the client side, when it was written, didn't know what kind of data they were going to get from different models. It might be a Nokia, it might be an Apple, it might be an Android. And so they write code that tries to grab as much as it can. And for some reports, it can grab more. Some phones, devices, environments, it can grab more than others. So what is JSON amalgamation? This is a term completely created by me to try to encapsulate what I was doing here. And it's a JSON built from analyzing other JSONs. It contains a superset of the JSON properties, and this is nested. So here we see a list of the properties. We saw the count here is 2. We saw the 2 reports. The first report did not have battery exploded, but the second report did. And so that's where the superset comes in. So this is a collapsed example of an amalgamation JSON, and it has the superset of the properties that the other JSONs had in them, the input JSONs. And so this contains details about the possible values of each JSON. So we have the type here, and then we have the values. So what we've done is we've just created an array, and it has what the value is and how many times we've seen that value. And so now that we know what a JSON amalgamation is at a high level, let's talk about why do we need JSON? Why do we need to amalgamate JSONs? Why am I doing a work project on the weekend for the sake of this talk? So that it's to make my life better. And what I mean by make my life better is it means to make our documentation at UCLA better. And not just at UCLA, the idea is to open source this at some point. We'll talk about that a little bit later. And I'd like to write it once now and have this functionality forever. So documentation is critical to software development. If you've ever developed anything, the documentation was your in to how that worked. Now, you might be saying, well, there was no documentation. And at which point I would say, well, the code was documenting itself, probably poorly, because that's how that works. But you have to read the code. And if that's the only documentation you have, that sucks. And that's why we're doing this today. So documentation teaches developers about the software they are using. So at UCLA, we have, like I said, a wide range of clients. We have a native team that works on Android iOS apps. We have a web team that works on web apps. We have an engines team that works on very low level embedded and builds the CLI tools themselves. And so they all interact with our APIs on the team that I'm in. So we've got dozens of developers trying to interact with our APIs. And the documentation when I first got here was very lacking. We've made a lot of strides to make that better. And this is just the next step in that. And the reason we're making these strides is so that we can have documentation that teaches other developers how to use our software and our APIs internally. Good documentation can save individuals and companies time and money. If you've ever used bad docs, you know how slow it can be. You know that it can, especially if it tells you something wrong, I mean, it can really cost you a lot of time. And so good documentation can save us all time, money, and honestly, frustration. And then documentation is best when up to date. So the whole process of amalgamation is creating these new specs so that our documentation is up to date with what we have. And then the process is obviously 15 years from now, if we never did anything better, we would end up in the exact same spot. Maybe we just amalgamate again, maybe we work on our processes. But the reason we need it is because it's going to help us keep our documentation up to date. So why do we need them again? To say it again, to help our developers document existing APIs by generating open API specifications. This symbol here is the Open API Initiative specification logo. And on the right, we see GitHub, we see Kotlin, we see JSON schema, Golang, Redoc, Swift, HTML5, and Java. Once we have Open API specifications, at Ookla, we use those specifications to generate a lot of things. So for instance, let's say we want to always have a download block in our JSON. Well, I'll make the Open API schema and I'll say download is required. And then we will go and generate a Swift client, a Kotlin client, a Go client, a JSON schema, JSON schema file that will compare the JSON that you're giving it and say, hey, you don't have this required download field. So then through this generation, and I'm realizing now you can't see the Java, that's one, it's underneath my head. But that generation allows us to do a lot. And so I'm not going to read this whole thing, but it basically says the Open API specification is a way to define what an API looks like so that humans and computers can use that information. And so this is a chopped up example. The column on the right starts at the bottom on the left of what an Open API YAML file looks like. So we have here the paths and we have a /pet. If you've ever used, this is a example that Swagger puts out about a pet store. So you probably see this somewhere else if you look up Swagger. But this is a route. It's the /pet route. It has a post verb that can be used on it. It also has a put verb, but all of this section here describes what the post action or contract for this API is. So you get a summary, you get a description, you get what the responses look like if they're 200. So if it's a 200, you're going to get back components, schemas, pets. And you also get information about the security here. But what we're really looking at when we amalgamate JSONs is the request body, because like I said, we're getting tens of millions of requests a day from clients that are decades old, and we want to know what that structure actually looks like. And so hopefully, if you've not seen Open API before, this interests you somewhat. I think if you have an internal API that has a contract that's well documentable so that you can say, hey, this is the JSON in, this is the JSON out, and you can write a description about what /pet does, this is huge. Anyone who's ever just been told, hey, go hit this endpoint, just go hit /pet. And you say, okay, I'll go hit /pet. And you go to hit it and you're like, wait, what do I need to send to it? What does /pet do? What happens if I post? What kind of response can I expect? And that's what Open API gives us, is it gives us that definition of the contract that our API adheres to, thus making information about about the API easier to attain and the developer experience of working with it way better. Huge fan of Open API, I really am. So then this is just, again, all the things that we're generating here. You can actually see Java this time. So I do want to give this quick caveat, just because I know that there are some people who may be looking at this and going, well, Bryce is giving me a hammer. A lot of things are looking like a nail. So I do want to say that we have a very specific use case for this. And there are absolutely other big data companies and long-lived organizations that will need this. It's not necessarily a tool that's going to be applicable everywhere. We do have decades of different legacy clients that weren't documented and that they have diverged from each other significantly over the years. We have large and complex JSON payloads. If it really was the 3 fields before, I would have just typed out the spec myself and we would have moved on. But because there are dozens of levels of nesting and there are complex objects, it really is too much for one person to go try and type. Like they'd pay me for a decade just to try to type it out, and then I'd be behind. And so with the script, hopefully I can get it done in a weekend. And then anytime I get behind, I can just run it again. You also need data that can be well represented in documentation. And what I mean by this is just if you have a kind of like God endpoint that kind of does everything and it's super complex, there are some things that don't work well in the Swagger documentation. Although I will say we have very complex endpoints that do a lot and are very overloaded, and it works well for us. And then our organization is ready to utilize Open API. I talked about how we're already generating all those client-side code. We're already generating documentation. We generate JSON schemas from our documentation. And then when people send us a report, we say, hey, is this a valid report? And then we can track, oh, we're getting invalid reports, and we can use that information to either fix the reports or fix our API. So we are ready. We're not ready. We are utilizing Open API, and we're trying to utilize it more. But that requires company buy-in. It requires employees to actually, want to use it, to know how to use it. And so it is a step, and we are getting better in that direction. So now that we know what we're doing, we're taking a mass set of input JSONs, we're amalgamating them so that we have information about all the individual fields, and then we're trying to get Open API YAML files out. So how do we do that? Well, this is exactly what I just said. We're going to parse the input JSONs, and we're going to build what's called an amalgamation JSON, which again is just a JSON structure that I made up that encapsulates all the data that I need. And then we're going to convert that amalgamation JSON into an OpenAPI 3 specification YAML file. So about this tool, it's a JavaScript CLI tool built using Commander. Commander is something that takes command line JavaScript and makes it not terrible to work with. If you ever write anything in JavaScript, like CLI tools type stuff, I highly recommend it. I kind of use it for anything that actually has to touch JavaScript. Generally, when I need to interact with a existing JavaScript project. And then what we're going to do, so now we have the command line tool. What does it do? It has two scripts. It has the amalgamate script, which is going to recursively parse the input JSON, and it's going to build the amalgamation JSON. And then we have the Open API script, which also recursively parses the amalgamation JSON and outputs an Open API YAML using the JS-YAML library. So as with any NPM script, you would kind of expect there to be a package.json somewhere. And so here we have it, the two scripts, the amalgamation and the Open API. And one note I want to say here is that you can see that the amalgamate, we're giving it an input and we're giving it an amalgamation parameter, and the same thing for Open API. And this is kind of dependency inversion, where I could have easily hard-coded these and then just change them each time. But as it is now, I can run node source / commands Open API, and I can write a script that will tell me all the outputs and tell me all the inputs for the amalgamations, and I can run multiple of them in parallel. So just that kind, so it's not, it runs individually based off the inputs that you're giving it, and so that you can specify multiple tracks, because at the end of the day, I have about 30 different types of reports that I need to run through this, and I am not going to type all of that out individually. I'm going to write a shell script that uses this to run everything through it on its own. And so then just again, Commander here is the command line tool. JS-YAML is how we're doing our YAML manipulation, and then Mocha's for testing, Lodash is for ease, and FS is for file system manipulation. So now let's look at all of this side by side. So what we have here is we have the two reports. So we got the device with Samsung Galaxy, we got the download with 86,000, and then we got the device Samsung Galaxy Note 98,000, and it's going to have the additional field of battery exploded true. So now recursion. I actually love this a little bit because it's not every day you actually get to write recursion, and it's not every day that recursion is the right answer. But this one, it definitely is, in my opinion. It makes the algorithm a lot simpler. So if you've never seen recursion in the wild, here's your chance. And when I say recursion, I mean that this is a function called recursive keys that is also going to call itself recursive keys. And so this right here, if given a object at a top level JSON, will crawl through all of the objects and all of their nested objects and visit each key and each object exactly once. So what's important to know here is that when it visits that key, it's going to call this handler. So let's look at this handler. This handler is fairly straightforward in that it really does one thing. It does this property.amalgamate, which we'll look at in just a second. This if is just saying, sorry, I did not specify this part before. When we ran our input JSONs through, we got an amalgamation.json. we can run that same input JSON set through again, and it'll add to our amalgamation.json. Because at the end of the day, I'm pulling S3 buckets full of JSON, and I'm iterating over all those JSONs and sending them through Amalgamate. And so it can always take more input and build upon itself. And so that's what this if else is. The else is, oh, I don't have an amalgamation already. And then the if is, I do have an amalgamation already. So now let's look at a property interface. I would say always code to an interface if you can. There are times where there are diminishing returns for that. But when you can do it, it is super nice. So we have a property interface here, which has two main functions, amalgamate and open API. So the amalgamate is how we want to amalgamate this property, and the open API is how we want to transform an amalgamated property into an open API YAML. So what does that look like in practice? Well, there are, if you're familiar with JavaScript or JSON, sorry, there's only so many types of values. And so each one of those types of values is a JavaScript type of a JavaScript prototype. No, it's not. It's a JavaScript type that has a prototype attached. But anyway, sorry. The end of it is that there's a property. And so when I go look up here at this download, I know that this is an integer. I go look at this version, I know that it's a string. I look at battery exploded, I know that it's true. And so when we're amalgamating, we want to handle each one of those things differently. A string is not the same thing as an integer. For instance, for an integer, we might want to know the minimum value we ever saw and the maximum value we ever saw. Whereas with strings, that doesn't make a ton of sense. Maybe you want to know the longest length, the shortest length. And so each type of property is handled slightly different. Sorry for scrolling up there. So here in the integer one, the constructor, don't worry about that. It's just some cruft. It just sets the type and does the first amalgamation because there's not really an amalgamation to happen here. But in the amalgamate step, which is us running the amalgamate script, what we do is we look through the values and we just try to find one that matches our value. And if we find it, we're going to update the count. So we're really just adding one more to it. And if we don't find it, then we're going to add a new one with the count. So what that looks like is this. We have the report on the side with the fields that we see. And if we look at just the download block, we're going to see 86,000, 98,000. And we're going to look over here. We're going to see 86,000, 98,000. You can see here the count is 2. That's because I sent the same group of reports through twice. So it saw it again and it added it up. And so from here, obviously, this is a very simple example. I mean, we're talking, tens of millions of reports getting run through this. So these value sets would be incredibly large. And so I really did kind of trim it down. It seems kind of silly when you're looking at it with just 2 values, but in reality, this would be millions of values for downloads and other things. And app version would have every app version we ever published. And so now that we have this, where we have the download, which is a type int, and it has the values of these 2 values here with their counts, what we can do then is look back at the integer property, right? Because we know that the amalgamation type is int. And when we recursively process to put it into Open API, well, then we're going to see how we want to do that. So I am recursion and now reduce. I'm just hitting all the hard stuff, I guess. But my mind just works like this is how you reduce it, because we have the data set of those values. And so what we're going to do for each one, and for integers at least, we're going to keep a running total. So this is the actual total of the value. This screenshot is actually old. There should be a times count here. Kudos to you if you notice that. And then the reduction, we're going to keep up with the total count. And then we're going to say, hey, is this the smallest value I've ever seen? If so, set it to the value. Is this the biggest value I've ever seen? If so, set it to the max. And then we're going to get back this object that has total, count, min, and max. And so what we return now is we know the type is integer because that's what it is going into Open API. Our int and amalgamation maps to integer in Open API. Our example, we want to pick an example that works here. What I've done is I've taken the total divided by the count and took the floor of that to make sure it's an integer, but that's just the average. There are other things that could be done here. I could take the median, and the median would probably be a better option here than just the average. And so we do have options for how we actually generate this. And we internally as a team are going to definitely have some conversations about that. But then we get the minimum and maximum out of it. And so those are the two steps. We saw the amalgamation step where we took these two reports with device, download, and version, and we combined them into an amalgamation. So now we have an amalgamation that has the values for download, it has the frequency with which those values occurred, and it has the type of those values. And then we're able to turn that into Open API YAML, which now has the value, which is down, or the property, which is download. It has the type with this integer. It has an example that makes sense. It's maybe not in the data set, but it does make sense. And it has the minimum and maximum value we've ever seen. Obviously, this is where we get into a little bit of trouble because the minimum download is really 0, right? And the maximum download is the fastest network that we can see. And so these values should not be taken, they will require developer oversight on the other side. But we're trying to get from having to ad hoc document 15,000 properties and like go type that out ourselves to having to just go look at 15,000 properties across all the teams and say, okay, this is why this is how this should change. I don't have to document the structure. I just have to document the changes better. And so, yeah, and so the future of JSON amalgamations. So the usage at work to document decades of report structure with human help. This is where I said, we might have to go touch those minimums, maximums. We might have to touch descriptions, which was something that was not written there. And once we've done that, in order to do that, I'd need to do support for arrays. If you notice that super recursive function did not handle arrays, that's because it would handle arrays, but it ignores what the amalgamation type is. So I have one more complex amalgamation type to write for that. Then I need to write tests. Anytime you're going to publish an open source project, you should always have tests for it. And then it will be open sourced and published to NPM as the script. And this is where the reason there's not a Git repo link for this today is because I talked to my boss. He basically said, if you write this, Ookla may adopt it as an open source project from Ookla, which would mean that we would get all of the developer resources and the great minds at Ookla to work on this script and make it even better. So I would much prefer to go that route versus having to maintain this open source project myself. But I think it's cool that Ookla is even entertaining that. We do have an open source Go K-tree distance calculation library, which is a bunch of stuff that probably doesn't mean anything to anybody. But so there is precedent for Ookla adopting open source packages written by people inside the company and helping to maintain them and strengthen them. And then the stretch goals here, Docker service. It would be really nice if this just ran as a service and every time I got a JSON, I could send the JSON to it so that the amalgamation was always building in real time and could help us detect changes in that way. But we can also get some of that through JSON schema validation once we actually have it all documented. And then partitioning input into data sets. We saw we have an app version. Maybe we want to say, okay, well, give me a spec for app 4.6.1 and give me a spec for 4.6.2. And then the other flexible structure support is that there are a couple pieces that for the purposes of making this work were hard. Like there's some fields in our JSON that we don't want to document. And so I hard coded, hey, if the property is underscore blah, 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 don't record it. I'd like to make that configurable. If anybody else wanted to use it, they would want to not have our hard-coded rules in there and instead have those configurable. So just a little more dependency injection there. And really, that is it. I mean, that's the whirlwind talk of JSON amalgamation. I created JSON amalgamation just as a type. It was the best word I could find. And basically, we took we're taking an arbitrary long, infinitely long list of JSONs. we're turning those into our custom data structure, which is an amalgamation JSON, which tells us stuff about each property in the JSON. And then we're taking that amalgamation JSON and we're turning it into an open API YAML file so that we can then use that in all of that great generation with like Kotlin, documentation, JSON schema validation, and everything else that we can use for that. And so that is JSON amalgamation. And I thank you, Lawrence, for offering to this spot up, because I probably would not have written this script yet if it had not been for this talk. And so I'm grateful that I got a chance to get motivated. And if anybody has any questions, I will absolutely answer them.
Fantastic. Let me ask
Brett,
everybody to turn their
Swagger was the early version of Open API. So sometimes you might see Swagger by SmartBear, which was donated to the Open API initiative, which is run by the Linux Foundation. So SmartBear no longer maintains Swagger. They gave it to the Linux Foundation, which rebranded it as Open API, probably because your bosses like that better than Swagger. And yeah, it was formerly known as that.
Well, I like to say I feel a whole lot better because when I heard the topic of the talk tonight, I immediately Googled it and was confused that I couldn't find any good deep research on JSON amalgamation. And I did a lot of Googling. So I'm happy to know now you couldn't find anything, Lawrence, because it didn't exist.
Right.
It's on the way. Hold on.
As a good developer, I did look for a tool that did this before I wrote it. There was not one out there. It is a pretty specific use case of not everywhere uses Open API, unfortunately. And also not everywhere has as much legacy clients that are still in prod today as we do. And so it was definitely, I think, a big data problem that's being solved here.
All right, guys, the floor is open for questions. Not all at once, but love to hear from you.
Yeah, I got a couple.
Yeah.
If you don't mind. So I was just curious, you showed like a string data type and then how you derived your example for that. Like I understood the averaging for the integer.
Yep. Yeah. So the string data type, it has the count for all the individual ones. And so it just takes the highest count and uses that as the example. So whichever one was the most frequent in there, it uses that. And that's why that interface is super nice, because I called amalgamate on an integer one and we saw how I use the average, how I use the min max. For strings, we call amalgamate, or I'm sorry, we call Open API on it. And that then can do completely different processing. And it just takes the example is the one with the highest count.
Cool. Thanks.
Or at least tied for the highest count. It's the first one with the highest count. If they were all ones, it'd take the first one.
Autumn, I think I saw a hand raised.
Yes, I did raise my hand. So this is more of kind of a general question on your process, Bryce. I know you said that you like built this as a response to kind of some things that like poor documentation or like lacking documentation at your own job. What's the like process for like identifying and prioritizing kind of like problems within your own organization and then keeping that communication open with like your team members and management and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a long process to get here to this part, because first we needed, there was a bullet point about your organization is ready to use Open API. We started using Open API for green fields projects. And so when we started using it for green fields projects, it was like, oh, this is kind of nice. We needed it to generate some of our Go models, which is like very heavily typed. And so it was very cool because our documentation was directly tied to our API, and that's where it stopped. And from there, we realized, well, wait, we can generate more things. We can generate things for the Android app, things for the iOS app, things for web, things for our servers internally. And we started generating more and more things. And as we did that, we realized, wow, there's a lot of value here. It's amazing to, when someone asks you a question, to just send them a link to some documentation. And like, obviously don't just send the link, give some context, but versus before where I'd have to go like read code and type it all out and then tell them that. And then the next person who had a question would ask, and I'd have to either copy and paste it, or I'd have to go write it all again. So first we adopted OpenAPI for green fields projects, and then we saw the real value from that, the real like just time saving in the development, the time saving in troubleshooting, the time saving in bug fixing, and the time saving in not shipping bugs in the beginning even. And from there, we realized, okay, it would be great if we had this all the way to the beginning of time. And that was kind of the jump to answer your question, like how do you convince people to get here, how, like what's the process of getting here. It was exposing the business value by doing it for greenfields projects to the point where everybody said, man, like why doesn't everything have this? Why doesn't everything have this documentation? This is great. We're saving time, we're saving money, like we're more profitable because of this. And then saying, okay, well, what is the process for documenting all legacy code? And we spent months, I mean, if not, I mean, me and my boss and I talked about this a year ago. And we're saying like, we don't know how to get there because there are, 40 different report types with like, 1,000 fields in each one of them that we don't know how to, like, short of telling somebody, hey, go look at all of these and type it out. We don't know how to get there. And so then that's where the like engineering brain comes in and goes, well, I have all the information, right? Like I have all the JSONs, I have the open API contract that I'd like to build from it. I know what those two sides look like. How do I get there? And if I could have gone straight from the JSONs into open API, I would have, but there's a step missing there, which is the amalgamation, which is adding all the individual values with their frequencies and having a structure that's capable of converting those to open API. So I know that was long-winded, but the high level bullet points is figure out the value that needs to be delivered, deliver some of that value as quickly and as cheaply as you can. Make sure everyone on your team realizes that value and is bought into that value, and then start getting greedy and saying, okay, now that we got this little value that I wanted in the beginning, and now people see how that little value is useful, how do I take that and change it into a big value? How do I make it even more valuable is how we got here.
Nice, that's super good insight, thank you.
You're welcome.
JC, I think you had a question or two or four.
Yeah, you know me. I got the first two questions, probably more. Three now. First, what do greenfield mean? Just if somebody don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it's the brand new project, right? Like we have the endpoint that takes in 37 billion JSONs. If we were to say, okay, all that code's over here, let's start in a green field and build it over here. So that's what greenfield. I think it's probably from like construction, where it's like, oh, it's a greenfields project versus like actually touching up an existing structure, or in this case, an existing software. So it's just brand new software that didn't exist before. Which is, and it's, as a developer, it's a great time, right? Because you get to kind of like take all your best engineering practices and put them in there, and the code's not legacy and old. And so it can be great if done well.
Thank you. A second one, what do Ookla get out of adopting the project? I mean, what value it get from them?
Yeah, so Ookla gets, so what does Ookla get out of this project? There's a couple things. One, the philanthropic, like, hey, we're doing open source, we're maintaining open source. And so like that's helps our GitHub, helps our SEO. Like there's some like small like marketing benefits there. But then the real thing that we're getting out of it is we will end up with like 40 Open API YAML files out of this that will document our existing APIs going back like 15 years. And then once we have that documentation, then we can get a lot out of it. Then we can get developers reading it so they know more about what's going on. We get product people reading it so they know more about what's going on. We get the ability to generate the JSON schema. We can generate client-side code, server-side code. So we get all the generation out of it, and we get all of the domain knowledge retention out of it. because the truth is there's somebody at Ookla who's been there for 15 years who wrote some of this stuff 15 years ago who maybe knows a little bit about how it works, but that doesn't help a brand new developer who comes into the organization. And so that as a brand new developer who didn't have open API, I'm hoping to leave the world a little better than I found it, so that the people who come behind me do have open API. And instead of having to read all the code that I had to read to figure out what was going on, they can just look at the clean React documentation and be able to learn it a lot faster. So domain knowledge retention, developer time, product time, just open API generation capabilities. So there's a lot, and that's out of us using it. As far as them maintaining the open source project, it means that the project itself will be stronger. I have no doubt that the code that I write will get changed and will get updated and improved by the 40 other engineers on my team, because it's an Ookla product, versus if I did it alone, Ookla can still get the value out of it, but the value they're getting is less because the project isn't as good because they didn't invest all of their employee time into creating it.
Wow. My final question on this, something I'll jump in. There's a lot of knowledge coming out of you right now. My last one is, how long did it take to build this project?
Yeah, okay, that's a great question. Definitely. So coding time, under 9 hours for sure. I got drunk one night and did the interface. I stubbed out all the interfaces, right? And I knew kind of the direction I was going in. I did write some recursion drunk, and I was like, oh, all of this is kind of in place to like do the stuff. And so I honestly don't have a great grasp of how long that took me, but it was not very long. 2 or 3 hours maybe, just to get the stuff in place. And then last night working through the bugs and like working through the bugs and working through exactly how much time it was probably another 5-6 hour session. It was mainly difficult because that amalgamation structure didn't exist. Like I had to create that. Like it seems real simple. Oh, there's an amalgamation type. Oh, there's an array of values. Oh, the values have a value and account. But all of that it took some tweaking and some figuring out to make that actually happen.
I see a hand raised from Coriano. Feel free to turn your mic on, Coriano.
Definitely. Hey, Bryce, how you doing?
I'm doing all right, man.
Good. My question is there any use cases where like amalgamation for the JSON would not be the right approach or not be beneficial?
Yeah, so I was trying to think, because I said earlier, as long as your code can be well documented. So imagine a world in which you just took a random JSON that had a single object with a key and a value, and you almost, I was gonna say WordPressy, but it's just like in the database, you wanna write whatever key and whatever value and the user ID, but that key value is never consistent. Then you can't exactly document that. If you're just going to take arbitrary input from people and then do something with it, then that's not really documentable. But there, for the most part, most APIs that we all use are going to be documentable. So if your API itself is not able to be documented, that's one case where I would not recommend amalgamation. The other case is if your JSONs are super simple, like, like I said, I just spent maybe 9 hours on this. If there were only 50 fields, I probably could have done that in 50 minutes, right? And so it would have been quicker just to do it without the amalgamation step. Or if you could also go back and get all those clients. The problem is we have 150 Android apps, 150 iOS apps. The web one luckily gets updated pretty well, unless you go to like the Wayback Machine and try to run a test. But we can't, I'm not sure I could even go get the like V1 Android app version in the lab today. Like I'm not sure I'd have access to that code, but the V1 Android version could still be submitting reports to us. And so if I could just go look at all the clients and say, hey, here's all the things that they could send, and that was going to take me less time than amalgamating all these JSONs, then that would be, more efficient use of my time.
Yeah. Thanks, man. Appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem.
Got a hand raised from DeMonte. Jump in there, man.
Hey guys, can you hear me?
Yep.
Hey, so I'm kind of new to this coding thing. I kind of like stumbled upon it, and this is actually my first meeting with coders, and I'm kind of curious. Where do I start? Like, I know you guys are talking about creating a whole nother like database, it seems like, or like a JavaScript or C++ type of software, but I don't even know where to start in my coding. Like, I don't know if I should go to school or should I go to a boot camp? Can you give me some insight?
Yeah, so real quick on the last point about coding schools and boot camps. Boot camps are great. Boot camps are amazing. I still have some student loan debt, and if you can avoid the student loan debt and get a career that pays you money, then that's great. I'll say boot camps do generally have a higher, I don't want to say higher failure rate. College is a pretty terrible failure rate too. But boot camps are, because they're a little bit shorter, they're a little more predicated on individual learning, and they're a little more predicated on you being self-motivated to go deeper and to learn a lot. And so that's the first answer I'd like to give is, if you can find a coding school that's within a real price range that makes a lot of sense for you, or even free, or that payback model, then I would 100% recommend that before I'd recommend the like massive undertaking that college is. And the truth is, I have a computer science degree. The degree does less for you coding in a program, in a job, than it does designing algorithms to amalgamate JSONs. And so just to say that either one of those are great options, honestly. And, you know, I would say definitely look around at some of the local boot camps. But as far as getting into tech, one, I would say there's no just uniform answer for this. There's no just like, yo, this is the right way. Different people learn different things. Different people have different opportunities. But the one thing that I know that you have to do if you want to get into tech is you have to use tech. You would be wise to find an online learning resource and just go through that. You know, you can literally YouTube right now JavaScript in 3 hours and find a JavaScript in 3 hours course, watch that course, and then say, okay, well, here's what they taught me. They taught me how to add two numbers. They taught me how to like, you know, put strings together like that, and then use it to do something. And don't worry about it being good. Don't worry about it being big. Just do something. Right? Like if you can do anything with it, you're gaining knowledge and you're learning. And that's probably, that's my biggest advice is do something and never stop learning. Because that's the reality of programming too, right? Like it's a very lucrative career, but it is constantly evolving. They're going to come out with a new phone tomorrow. 5G is dropped. There'll be 6G at some point. There will be new operating systems. There will be new types of chips in the new MacBook Pros. Like it's always changing, and so you're always going to have to learn a little bit. So learning how to learn is crucial, but most importantly is just that moment. Just do something. Like I spent 3 years just coding alone in a room, and this is like while I was like working towards college, and this is when I really wish that I had just gone to a boot camp and got my career started. But then I spent that time kind of alone in a room. I had great plans. I was going to remake hot schedules. This is this thing that like the Outback Steakhouse and Carrabba companies use to like manage their time. I was worked on the thing for like 3 weeks. It was terrible. It was no good. It was like no one was ever going to buy it as a product. But the things that I learned while trying to do that, while trying to do something that was outside of my comfort zone, are what led me to like land jobs, or, you know, would land me to like have the perspective of, oh, what is it like to try to like greenfield software? What is it like to try to write these things? So my biggest advice is learn something and then use what you learn and just do that over and over and over and over and over again. And, you know, eventually your skills will be good enough and you'll be employable. Keep coming to Code Connector, join MemTech, do all those things. And, you know, definitely reach out to me. I can point you to some free like web learning stuff. I can also, you know, I'm always down to troubleshoot some code that I know how to write. I'm down to troubleshoot code I don't know how to write, languages I don't know how to write too, just mileage may vary.
Yeah, I appreciate you, man. Really, seriously.
Yeah, no problem, man. And like I said, I'm in Code Connector Slack. Like, feel free to reach out. And you know, in the beginning, you've got to just learn the basics. You need to know what an if statement is. You need to know what a for loop is. You need to know what a while loop is. You need to understand what a database is. And in the beginning, just work on just seeing as much as possible. And then from there, once you're 1-2 years into it, maybe employed already, then start trying to specialize. I'm like, well, I'm gonna go all in the data. Like the wider your net of learning now, the better. And the fact that you're here is already a great sign, because it shows initiative. It shows that you're outside your comfort zone in an environment learning about stuff.
Most definitely. I got the C++ book. I was thinking about learning that first, and then Java, and then Python.
Mhm.
But I might just go with Java first. Yeah, I might go with Java.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, honestly, anything you want to cut your teeth on is going to be good for you.
Right.
I will say there's definitely a huge web boon right now. Like a lot of people writing React and JavaScript, and which is slightly different than Java. And not even slightly, it's very different than Java.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And just that, and for a lot of people getting into tech, and this is definitely my experience as well, being able to like look in a browser, like type something over here and look in a browser over there is kind of nice to be able to see it, versus if you're doing like a lot of Python scripting, you're going to get a lot of text in, text out, which can make it a little harder to grasp. So I would just say, just explore all the languages and just kind of like play around with them, because, an if statement is an if statement, whether it's Python, Java, C++.
So wait, is the languages the same, or is it the symbols, like the elements? The place brackets, you know what I'm saying?
Yep.
I don't know.
I would say the concepts are the same, right? An if statement is conditional branching, right? So if my age is over 21, then I can buy beer. If it's not, then I can't, right? That concept is the same in it doesn't matter if it's C++, it's if the age is greater than this. Doesn't matter if it's Scala, it's if the age is greater than this, then I can do that. So those kind of like base level concepts translate between languages. And then, every language is not created equal. So there are definitely concepts that are language specific. But if you're just starting out, any of the basics are going to transfer across all of them.
Perfect. Cool.
And for real, man, reach out to me if you have any questions, or, you're like, hey, I'm trying to, like, even if I don't know a lot about, C++ or those type of things, I can help you find a person who does. Engaging in the community for sure. Like getting in.
Now, do I reach you on this? The meetup?
Yeah, you can definitely reach me on there. I'll also, I know it's Code Connector. I'll also point you to Memtech in those scenes. I think they have a little more of like they have a little more specific tech channels, like the sysadmin channel, the Linux channel, the JavaScript channel. Like they're kind of a little more tailored to like specific learning. And so, Code Connector, way better about like the social events, way better about like the personal side of it. But then when you want to get into a specific topic, I definitely recommend being in both, and the more the better, honestly.
Bro, I can't wait to get into it, seriously. So yeah, man. Appreciate you.
It's fun. It's hard. Don't let me undersell it.
No, I know.
It is hard. It's a lot of work, but it is not only lucrative, but it's also legacy. I say that a lot. Don't lie. I tell myself that a lot, that some of this code I'm writing will be here 1,000 years from now, which is something that you can't say for a lot of jobs.
I would say high risk, high reward, because, cool.
Any other questions? Those are some great ones, by the way. If not,
it was a quick one. Yeah, I had one that kind of scrolled by. I was just curious if any of your APIs were like public, or are you mainly doing for internal developers?
It's all of the above. The main ingestion APIs are absolutely public. They have to be hit from all across the world by all kinds of clients, and they also get hit by individual web pages. And so we do have obfuscation, we do have, API type security there, but they're not behind they're not behind a VPN or any type of private access like that. But we do also have internal only APIs. Those are a lot less documented. Those are a lot less, they get a lot less focus, right? Because they're not as important as the other, or they're not as not important, but they're not as publicly facing and ultimately detrimental to our money if they go wrong.
Yeah, I worded that wrong. So I was looking at the consumer side, like, do you provide external access to your APIs? So not public as in your own things or accessing them, but to partners, I guess, or something to
Yeah.
use your data.
So we not
That's-
only support our own Android and iOS apps, we also have a mobile SDK that can be installed in third-party apps. And we also have a similar thing for JavaScript, so it can be installed in third-party websites. So we do, in those moments, basically give users access to our source code, and their reports come to us, but they can also send them to themselves. Type deal. So the SDKs, I think, kind of solve what you're saying. We don't like say, oh, hey, here's our open API specification, you can send us whatever you want. Although we definitely have used open API to document some services that we're not implementing. So AT&T, T-Mobile, like, we gave them an open API spec, and they're going to run a server, and then we're going to hit it with the requests that we dictated in the open API spec. So not even all, so we don't even run every server that we have an open API spec for, which is a very interesting, it's interesting, right? To design an API for AT&T and T-Mobile for every ISP in the world, and do that through open API YAML, and then consume it on the other side. It's wild.
I got it. So there's a potential where your amalgamated open API spec could be given to one of those developers.
Right. So we have the mobile SDKs have the specification dictated already, right? And so the amalgamation is just strengthening our APIs, right? Like, it's filling in gaps for us. But yeah, exactly like you're saying, we would then have stronger documentation to supply to the external parties.
Thank you.
Awesome. So I want to ask a favor of everybody here. If you guys could all turn on your mics at the same time. I'm going to wait to say the next part until I see all the greens. This is just my silliness that I love to do. I would love to just act like there's a huge stage in front of you, because there is. Let's give let's give Bryce the biggest hand we can possibly do for that awesome information. There we go. Make you feel loved. Yeah. Thanks, man, for coming out tonight. That was awesome. As always, You're not new around here, and I'm sure you'll be back for one in the future. Thanks, everybody, for hanging out with us and coming on a Tuesday night to yet another Zoom meeting. You must really like us, so appreciate that. Y'all have a great night until the next time. We'll see you all.
Yeah, y'all too. Have a good one.